Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to dtalks, that is Disruptive Talks on Education. And today's topic is achieving initiatives being undertaken in achieving FLN. And we have with us Oindrila Senyal. She is a Teach for India fellow catering to 74 opinionated and energetic girls at a government school in Delhi. Post her master's from the London School of Economics and Political Science, she joined the fellowship to understand the state of education landscape at the grassroots, which would help her to navigate through the policy sector where she hopes to be in the coming years. Towards the effect, she co founded Policy Light, a social enterprise to bridge the policy implementation knowledge gaps for different stakeholders in the education system. Welcome to the show, Andrilla. So, without wasting much time, here's the first thing I want to ask Oindrilla. So, Oindrilla, what has been your motivation to join Teach for India?
Thanks a lot, Anupama. So I studied social sciences in my undergrad, and then I went on to do my master's. And during that time, I realized that social sciences is a subject not a lot of Indian students like to study, right? And post that, I also did a bit of foreign policy. I tried to understand things from the macro level. And towards that effect, I realized a lot of the problems in the society that we have with regard to health, with regard to education, could be solved if we look at it from a very micro perspective, right? Just trying to understand what's the base of the problem. And that sort of enabled a shift in me where I understood, like, the education is the microcosm of the society, right? And if we could just enable change in the classroom, there's a lot that we can achieve in the civic
Right.
society. And towards that, I sort of started working in an international school once I returned. It was attached with the Cambridge board, right? And I tried to understand how international history works, how the language system works. And I realized a lot of the things are absent in the Indian education sector. And of course, in India, the education sector is dominated by public schools, right? The governmental systems. And if we want to enable a change, I think that's where we should start. We should start sort of remodeling the public school system, the government schools, the teacher training, everything that stems in the public school system. And that's when Teach for India happened. And like you rightly mentioned, the whole purpose was to sort of understand what the grassroots realities are, to then base upon the further initiatives. So Policy Light also came into effect as a part of Teach for India experience, I would suggest. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. That's very interesting. So, going on to the next question, what are some examples you can give to elucidate the challenges that exist with regard to literacy in government classrooms?
So I entered the fellowship during the pandemic, right? And a lot of, I mean, most of the learning was completely virtual. And like, I'm sure you've also witnessed this, Anupama, that there was like a slide in student learning, right? Where whichever
Absolutely.
levels they sort of had, that had taken a completely dip. And even though I teach secondary grades, Teach for India also caters to elementary classrooms. And we've seen that, of course, in the absence of a teacher giving instructions, the grade level, the grade learning level that we talk about, it had widened, right? There was no continuous practice of phonetics. There was no continuous practice of learning, right? Like reading, in traditional sense that we talk about. So that was one of the gaps that I noticed. And even though in my secondary classrooms, I could see that these kids, let's say, who could read maybe 2 3 sentences per minute, that rate had gone down because there was like access divide, there was network issues, so regular classes were not being held. And this problem in literacy actually impacted other subjects too, because it actually, like had like an adversarial impact on maybe science, the way they were comprehending a scientific problem, right? And I think this was one of the major issues. And the second thing, of course, because I cater to low income group communities, a lot of the parents at that time, um, they had to sort of think about what to eat, and they were out of jobs. So, education had taken a back burner then, and not a lot of sort of conversations happened around, maybe just practicing comprehension. So what we would do in classroom would be just like, asking the students to read particular paragraph. Somebody else would then explain it. These were not being, done regularly online, or was not being able to be sort of, we couldn't do it. So I think this was one of the major issues that we also saw. And and that was like 2020. Of course, the gap sort of continued in 2021, and with, school closure, school reopening, I think that has increased exponentially even now. So I think that was one of the issues I would say that the pandemic has definitely given us with.
Right, right, very rightly said. So we have really gone back, and there has been a huge shift in the literacy level, and whatever we had achieved initially, we've gone back by 20 years, I believe.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah. So going on to the next question, there is I would like to ask you from experiences to then moving on to what this decade could mean for India's education landscape.
So this,
Like,
I
to what
mean,
extent is the NEP equipped to tackle literacy challenges in India as schools start to reopen?
even though we were endowed with the pandemic in 2020, we also had NEP come into effect, right? After, like, I think a gap of 34 years, there was like,
Right.
suddenly education was at the forefront. There was a lot of talk on experiential learning, curriculum needs to be revamped. And I think one of the things that came into effect is the talk on foundational literacy. At least people are talking about it. The need to sort of achieve foundational literacy was at least at the forefront. And of course, NEP has this really like laid out vision that by 2026, by 2027, at least a grade 3 student should be able to read and comprehend basic words, should be able to sort of understand. Uh, but the implementation part is what is yet to be seen. Of course, it was drafted in 2019, and of course brought into effect in 2020, but a lot has changed since pandemic. So if we have to sort of move forward, we have to like understand what are the other parameters that are coming into effect with, let's say, students, like you mentioned, Anupama, a couple of minutes ago, that students have sort of gone back 20 years, right, in their learning. So how are we then equipping ourselves as well as the teachers? Whilst we are discussing about students, we sometimes forget how the enabling factor comes into picture. And that's where our facilitators, our teachers come into being. So how are we equipping their training? Of course, NAP mentions this. It's alluding towards it, but not like completely sort of laying down its implementation process. But of course, NAP is a vision document, and a lot is yet to be seen as to how that then sort of gets implemented. And of course, there are other factors in the sense that the foundation literacy will be implemented in different states. So how does the different state governments then take it into consideration? What are the challenges there? So I think these are all yet to be seen, and these are all yet to be figured out. But nonetheless, I feel the whole conversation around foundational literacy is on the cards, and I think that is what's needed. I mean, I could give you an example. Of course, there's a lot of discussions that keeps on happening at the top, right? At the governmental level, teachers are talking, but the main drivers is also the parents, like they are major stakeholders. And in a recent PTM, a parent teacher meeting that we conducted in our school, so the student is a secondary student, studies in 10th grade, but also has younger siblings in first or second grade. So once talking to the parent sort of started saying, but a lot of learning loss has happened, and I can notice this in my younger kid, that she could read these simple sentences, but now it's a little difficult for her to comprehend. and I wonder what we can do to support her. And this parent that I'm talking about is really going through abject poverty at this point of time, lost jobs here and there. So the fact that a parent is also taking this into consideration shows, I think, shows light at the end of a dark tunnel. And I feel like
Right.
together we can sort of, take it forward. And I
Yeah.
think this is
Great.
something else that, like a stakeholder management, right? Like keeping all the stakeholders in play to sort of then move forward. I don't think it can only be achieved with just like a vision document in place. If it has to be implemented, then there are other factors that we need to pull in, I would say, Anupama.
Yeah. True. True. So, why is it crucial to achieve foundation literacy?
So one of the things is definitely, like I mentioned earlier as well, it's a gateway towards other, let's say, other skills, other subjects, and also rigor in terms. So if we do not have like foundational literacy achieved at a very early stage, it is difficult, or studies have shown that it is difficult to achieve rigor in the later years, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a simple thing. The gap widens and it keeps widening. So that's one
Right.
of the things. The second thing being that literacy is the base upon which the superstructures of other subjects are built, right? I mean, if you cannot comprehend basics, so even for us, right, we are talking, you're talking, and I am sort of replying. So the comprehension works because I'm being able to understand the words that you're using. I'm being able to sort of, break it down into pieces. And then that's how my brain is processing. So if I cannot understand that, then it gets very difficult for me to even do basic things, like basic things like even conversing. Uh, maybe reading a book or sitting for a job interview or anything of that sort. And something else that we've also realized, this term is inclusive education is of primordial importance. And we've seen that a lot of our kids, of course, face different issues. And one way to sort of bridge that inclusive education is to provide them with same resources in the form of foundation literacy. So this is the other sort of factor that I would say is of primordial importance in achieving literacy rates, right? And another thing that I think is also important is how we build into the workforce. We know that these skills are important. Comprehension, speaking, writing, these are like the base of getting into a job, talking to a friend, getting on with our daily lives. Even when you want to go and buy something, you want to call up a customer care and you want to talk to them about it, that hey, this is what my problem is. You need these basic skills. And when we say foundational literacy, of course don't mean just English per se, but just the skill of it. How do we convert comprehension, reading, writing into actionables in our practical life? So I think these are the main areas why foundational literacy becomes very important.
True.
And the way that we can build our children, because of course they are the future shapers. And this is the gift that we can give them, create a base where they don't have to struggle with basics, right? Because then later on when they move upwards, I've heard teachers say, but she can't read these basic words. It's just that they've not been given opportunities to sort of get that kind of, I would say, education. So I think that
Right.
is why we should put our weight behind foundational literacy at this point of time.
Very nice. Very nice way of illustrating this. So, what are some of the parameters different stakeholders need to, I would say, basically consider towards achieving literacy at grade level?
So you're talking about like considering
The
that
government
the pandemic.
educators, the parents. I mean, how would you think these parameters um, are basically different parameters which different stakeholders need to consider towards achieving literacy at the grade level?
So firstly and foremost, they should accept that the pandemic has happened, and that we need to sort of reorient our pedagogy, reorient our thinking. So accepting that there has been a setback, right? and there needs to be a differentiated learning at this point of time. Of course, all of these children that we talk about in terms of literacy, even their rate of understanding, their rate of practice has taken a setback. So bringing that kind of a mindset first, and then thinking about implementation processes in terms of differentiation. So thinking of what rigor do these kids fall in terms of literacy, in terms of classrooms, right? And this then leads to the teacher training part. The teachers are overburdened with a lot of administrative work as well. And they've been the frontline workers, at least for me, I would say in the last 2 years, along with the medical staff. I think they've done a great job just
Yeah,
ensuring that learning, yes, Anupama, like just learning reaching to these to the kids.
yeah,
uh, and in certain cases in rural sectors, I know that they've sent worksheets so that kids don't run out of that practice. So focusing on teacher training, a lot of the times what happens, they're just given these worksheets, asked to do it. But how do you then ensure that this is done in place, right? So more teacher training in terms of literacy, more teacher training in terms of differentiated, like imparting differentiated learning in literacy to these to them. And the third factor I would definitely say is a robust system of M&E, monitoring and evaluation, right? Just thinking about how they're going to assess this whole situation. And of course, we also need to reconsider how we're going to approach the whole blended learning sort of scenario, considering that schools are opening, shutting down, new variants coming into place. So we cannot always keep education at the back end, right? And that has to be at the front. So for that, we need to sort of consider if this is going to be the case, if hybrid scenario is going to be the case, and if new variants are going to continue sort of plaguing the society with, how do we then utilize hybrid model to then create a mechanism of literacy modules? Could
yeah,
be, I mean, at the top of my head, it could be like you have 3 days of classroom even for little children where they practice with the kids, where they practice with the teacher, sorry, read alouds, uh, you know sort of practicing their phonetics and all of that. And then 3 days they practice worksheets at home by taking help of parents. So just thinking that from like a hybrid lens as to how the blended learning model can then work in achieving that level of foundational literacy, I would say these are some of the things that we could think about or begin to think about as we move forward.
yes, yes, very rightly put. So somebody in the audience is writing that teachers have gone out in villages as well to teach the children, and also the teachers have themselves geared up themselves and put extra effort to learn various online teaching techniques, which is so much. I mean, it has been a huge learning for the teachers also, which is again a very big thing. Um, so, what are the certain initiatives that you think will enable India towards achieving that goal? And here you can talk about Nipun Bharat mission.
Absolutely, Anupama. Like you've mentioned, like you beautifully helped me segue into the answer. So, like I mentioned, so NEP, of course, like outlines how foundational literacy of primordial importance, and Nipun Bharat, of course, it's in a mission mode, right? Which obviously bolsters the importance of it. Just activating every agents, every stakeholder in the education system to take up uh, foundational literacy battle at this point of time, right? And Nipun Bharat Mission was launched last year in July with the aim to sort of, achieve foundational literacy and numeracy by 2026, 2027. The way that they would do it, of course, it's like a 5 tier program where the start is of course at the national education ministry of education level, but it also then percolates down into the district, into the state district blocks, and of course it goes down even deeper into the school and school management systems, right? So of course there's like a curriculum, there's going to be like a centralized curriculum focusing on foundational literacy so that kids between the age group of 3 to 9 can at least have grade level learning. And in order to equip the teachers, we also have something known as nishtha, to enable teacher training in this aspect. So of course, uh, FLN and Nipun Bharat is being like, at least the talks are being implemented in a couple of states, but there's still yet to be seen how that looks like. But as an educator, I would say I'm really happy that so soon there is like a mission mode. Like, automatically when you hear the word mission, Anupama, and I think you'd agree, you feel the urgency, right? Like, you
Right.
feel urgency in the whole aspect. And even as part of a civic society, you feel there's something being done. So I think Nupun Bharat is one such, I would say, one such initiative uh, towards achieving foundational literacy, at least in India.
Right.
And whether or not we achieve it by 26, 27 is yet to be seen. But like I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier as well, the fact that there is a proper plan being laid out, where it does not only talk about the top to bottom, but it lays down how the blocks and the districts can be taken into consideration, the rural, especially the rural parts, because that's where the majority of learning loss happened, I would say. Of course, we
Yeah.
keep on hearing a lot about the urban education landscape, but we don't get to hear a lot about what happens in the rural sector. So I think it's only yet to be seen what it's going to do, but the plan looks really promising. And I just hope the teacher training and the parental and engagement sort of kickstarts. uh, so yeah, so Nipun Bharat is something that I'm like I think is sort of on its path towards just sort of reducing that gap, I would say.
Yes. Yes. So we really wish ourselves the best for that, that we are able to achieve FLN by that 25, 26 at
Absolutely.
least. What could be certain bottlenecks towards achieving the goals delineated?
So one, of course, teacher training is mentioned, but we don't know how to what extent the differentiated teacher training is. Of course, the second thing that also comes under the purview of teacher training is the number of teachers, right? There hasn't been active recruitment. So again, the same thing. There will be more work being vested upon the teachers along already what they have. So that's
Yeah.
that's another thing that needs to be taken into consideration. So more, I think, active hiring of teachers, maybe just taking help from the B.Ed colleges, the young teachers, even they can support or supplement the existing teachers. So I think these could so that's one. Okay, I'm giving recommendations now, but that goes hand in hand, I would say. So yeah, teacher training, I think, is one. There's no differentiated sort of teacher training there. And the curriculum is centralized. Of course, India has like diverse backgrounds and even language, right? So a centralized curriculum will sort of act as an impediment.
Yeah.
Something that we always see, in a classroom, a kid hasn't seen cobblestones, but gets to read about cobblestones in an Enid Blyton novel. That becomes a problem for that kid to then picture what exactly
Yeah.
it is that he or she is reading about. So it's the same problem. There is like a centralized curriculum, no context given. So that might also act as an impediment, because, of course, it states that the central government will frame it, and of course, the state can revise plans. But to what extent do they have autonomy? To what extent can they revise it? Is still yet to be seen. So that
Yeah.
also might act, I think, as an impediment. And of course, I understand the need to have a timeline in mind. But as an educator and somebody who started during the pandemic, and I'm sure other teachers would also agree, the timeline is a little too stringent. The only thing
Yeah.
being, of course, the implementation. Even in the Nipun Bharat initiative, it is written explicitly that, of course, after all, the implementation depends on the teacher. And we know that how much work is yet to be done considering the pandemic has, shifted us 20 years back, like you mentioned. So then the timeline becomes very stringent, very narrow, and it just becomes difficult to then achieve what we have set out to achieve in this small period of time. But I
Yeah.
understand the need to, keep like a cap and over ambitious goals so that at least we reach somewhere. So I think these are some of the issues that we can foresee in its implementation. And of course, another thing at the top of my mind is also the dropout rates. Like a lot of kids have also sort of, been taken out of the school system. So bringing them back, trying, sort of ensuring that they adjust and adapt to the system, and then starting with, because you can't just start with, syllabus right at the outset, talk about literacy. You have to sort of first, I think, wire, orient them into the system and then start off. So I think that would also play into the timeline part. That might also act as a setback, I would say.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So, what would be certain recommendations as an educator towards mitigating these roadblocks?
One that I mentioned earlier was like a strong monitoring and eval, right? A lot of these initiatives that we have, of course, we have monitoring and evaluatory metrics, but these are defined by to what extent or how large the project is, as opposed to, continuous assessments. So I think creating these rubrics not just at the central state, but also like school wise, class wise. So there needs to be like a mechanism in place to build this metric. And the metric cannot work if there is no accountability factor, right? There needs to be, quick checks and frequent checks as to these are happening. Because, it tends to sort of it tends to sort of wane off, like as and when you're moving forward. So I think like a strong robust M&E system with like a comprehensive accountability metric, I think would work in this factor. And I'm a firm believer that you can get a lot of feedback, right? So including parent voices into what's working, what's not working, to what extent the kids have been doing at home. Just ask them. Uh, so I teach secondary kids, so I would also say, ask the kids as well. Include. So of course, all these policies are made, but student voices are very important. They would be able to say whether they're what's that one hurdle their sibling is facing, or what is that one problem they face when they are reading a particular sentence, or what's the problem with retaining that kind of information. So include more voices in these conversations rather than just like um I think restricting these conversations to just the officials. I think including more parental feedback, student feedback, time to time, and then building on the next approaches could also help in alleviating these roadblocks, right? Something else that I've also realized during the course of my fellowship, and also sort of, talking to other fellows, is just how contextual curriculum is of importance, at least in India. So bringing books, something that Pratham and Story Weavers, so they do like a great job, right? Like they have these stories which are contextual to Indian context, right? You also have organizations like Simple Education Foundation, and they did a partnership with Pratham Books, where so Simple Education Foundation has a school in Gullar, and so when they were trying to sort of impart foundation literacy there, they realized that there are very few stories which are based out of those kids' experiences. So then they partnered with Pratham, and they've sort of illustrated and written like a good number of stories so that the kids could then understand the language from their context and their surroundings, right? So I think more of those are required. We need more of publishings of those books, those stories in contextual learning. um, and another thing that I feel the pandemic has also shown is the importance of integrating different curriculums together. So, how are we ensuring that literacy is not just, trying to achieve the goal of just ensuring that the kid is learning how to comprehend, how to write, and how to speak, but also gaining other core competencies that a child of that age could get. So maybe integrating an SEL paragraph, an SEL story. So maybe trying to understand, okay, how friendships work, right? Why friends are important, integrating not just literacy but also numeracy, and then trying to understand how relationship between two numbers work. So friendship in real life, reading about friendship, and then trying to understand relationship in numbers. So I think integrated curriculum is also something that we can think about, because these cannot work in silos, right? If we want to prepare our students for the future world, for them to solve 21st century skills, I think the preparations need to start way before. And
Right.
something that we often do is we keep on saying that they're younger children, they won't be able to understand, they won't be able to say, let's just focus on these. Where I feel it's very important to start conversing, start talking about these from a very early age, to build upon the core competencies in the later years, because of course it's the building block, right? You create a base, then you create the second base, and you create a building. So I think that's something that we need to focus on.
Wow. So you have a lot of input to all this, which is brilliant. Moving on to some global scenario in terms of literacy, what are certain common trends that you have noticed in literacy movements across countries and demographics? Can you also share some differences and what prompted those?
So, of course, United Nations, they've laid out literacy as of seminal importance, right? And the 2030 agenda talks about how we need to sort of get into a mission mode towards enumerating literacy as of importance, and something that India is already doing, right? If I had to sort of draw synergies between other countries, I would definitely say a lot of the sub-Saharan countries and some Southeast Asian countries too. Uh, it's the same problem that we are facing in terms of achieving literacy. More than 70% of students uh, at outside school, they do not have grade level understanding. Same problems with regard to access, because now learning has become an access in terms of technology, right? Because of virtual classrooms. Similar problems. Education has second consideration as opposed to the first, because the parents are migrant workers, they are out of jobs. So these are similar problems that I would state in Indian demography, as well as, I mean, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and a lot of African countries. I would say, and most of the countries have sort of taken the 2030 UN agenda to be like the base upon which they are working. An example would be Uganda's focus is on UPE, Universal Primary Education, where they've been actually working for more than 2 decades on ensuring, foundation literacy is achieved. And towards that effect, they've also talked about a vision, something that we are also looking towards to achieve by 2026, 2027. Uganda also has something known as the Uganda vision, and their foundation literacy plays like a major part. So what interesting is that in all of these countries where foundation literacy is still yet to be achieved, they are mostly low income countries, or so developing or underdeveloped countries, right? And the differences where we notice where they're probably, so for example, America at this point of time will think about how to ensure that there are lesser college dropouts rather than achieving foundation literacy, right? So the differences that we see in other demographics are mostly in developed countries. So Finland has an education system. So I think what we need to see, and the parameters that we need to gauge, is what are they doing that sort of, so that they don't have to think about these. And some of the
Hmm.
things that come at the top of my mind is, of course, teacher training, come like, bringing education into the agenda, I would say, into the political agenda, talking about education. um and like, for example, we are the first to close our school in India and the last to open schools. So what does it tell us about where our mind is? Just something to think about. Even during the pandemic, schools were open in a couple of countries. They of course maintained um, all the they sort of they undertook precautions, they maintained procedures. Now I understand, I'm cognizant that uh, our country is huge, there are a lot of things into perspective, but maybe now is the time to then rethink those. And the differences then stem from that. What are we learning from these countries? What are we understanding from these countries, right? Because again, like I mentioned, these are vision documents. Plans can come and plans can go unless and until we equip our civic society to understand this is the need of the hour. Things might not change. Because recently, a lot of the parents were also talking about how school reopening is important, especially for the primary grades, for the same reason, that they are going back in their comprehension level, cannot read basic texts. And I wouldn't say that's just limited to the low income group schools, but also it is sort of percolating into the other sort of demographics as well. So I think
Yeah,
these are some of the learnings we need to take into consideration.
yeah, yeah. Uh, how have certain countries tackled these challenges in the wake of pandemic?
So South Korea, I would say, has done well in terms of getting literacy. Another country that I recently had the chance of, like reading about, and I spoke to a couple of people, is also Malaysia. It is a Southeast Asian country, but in terms of reducing the digital divide, they've been able to sort of, provide digital access to over 70% of students. And their focus was also on literacy, on foundational literacy, and I'm hoping that helped in bridging that gap a little,
Okay.
uh, at least in terms of literacy, I would say. And
Oh,
if I have to come back to our own country, I would say that the Nipun Bharat initiative that we talked about a little while ago is like one of a kind at this point of time, considering that everybody felt the urgency to bring about an initiative in the wake of a pandemic and not think
very
about
true.
other things. So like thinking like, it's at the base, and of course there will be other host of challenges, but we need to make it a priority. So I think India should also feature into the conversation.
Yeah, yes. Um, so, to what extent have we been able to co create a global movement towards achieving required literacy levels across continents?
It's an interesting question, Anupama, because I feel the civic society is of primordial importance, and we do have certain players, right? We have civil society organizations. The one that I work for is also civil society organizations, and what we did, we would create like a template of worksheets, differentiated literacy worksheets, and we would um, sort of distribute it among the other fellows, and they would then customize to their classroom and they would try to work upon. So like this, there were other initiatives taken by other CSOs. There were talks happening between parents. There were people acting as volunteers as well. So I feel these have helped, along with, so Teach for India is also part of the Teach for All network, right? And during this time we've had a lot of sharing and learning exchanges. So these kids, so it's an interesting point, how we also always think language as a mode of communication, right? So a lot of the times I've seen that kids in elementary sections in India, they've also witnessed classrooms, let's say in Nigeria. There, let's say the mode of communication is very different. Of course, the language they don't understand, but they've still practiced and they've still shared their experiences. So I think these have also enabled building that global movement and also brought in the need for creating a global structure that can be contextualized, I feel. And I would say the civic society has worked a lot, and if we continue to do this, I think a lot can be achieved in this sense, that we have like a framework. Cool. Now how can we bring in um, organizations like Pratham? How can we bring in certain language experts into the picture, and create studies, bring about simplistic worksheets, and also think about how to tutor parents.
Yeah.
I know a lot of the parents, they are interested to learn, but they don't know where to find these resources. I know
Hmm.
YouTube is a great starter, but it's just a starter. So why don't we create like a pool of those resources for
Yeah.
parents to then learn and for them to then practice? Because now that the kids are mostly at home, we also need to think about that, right? Simple things, not very difficult, simple things. And if you think about it, Anupama, in a way we are also helping the parents, because I know a lot of the parents that I cater to, they also need basic literacy skills. So in a
Yeah.
way we are trying to qualitatively impact the society we are living in.
Right.
uh, so I think that's the power of the civic society that we need to pool in. So like civil society organizations, volunteers, people who really want to do something but they don't know where to do, what to do. So
Yeah.
just like figuring these out, featuring these out into the picture.
Right. Right. So, how do we sum it up? Lastly, your hope for the decade as we navigate around post pandemic adjustments.
Okay. Um, so I think the fact that there has been a pandemic and we need to, and whatever the education system was pre-pandemic was not the ideal one. So in the next decade, I would definitely want, or I would love to see if there is more experiential learning, integrated curriculum, and the goal that we've set out, both for Agenda 2030 in terms of UNSDG and also the Nipun Bharat mission, that we at least achieve half of it. And that, the talk on foundational literacy becomes like a study later on in the decade, acting as, like a phenomenal initiative that worked. And yeah, just hoping that whatever learning loss that happened, I'm hopeful, I'm an optimistic person, so that we are able to at least bridge some of it, I would say.
Awesome. It was great listening to you, and thanks for being on these talks. It has been really, really enriching your thought process, the kind of ideas you have come up with. It was such a pleasure meeting you. So, thank you very much again, and good evening, and have a great evening, everybody. And with this, we wind up the talks. This is
Thank
Anupama
you.
signing off. Okay.
Thank you
Thank
so much,
you.
Anupama. It was a
Thank
pleasure
you.
talking to you. Thank you.
Same here. Same here. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.